Hi, thanks, Hattie, for that introduction. I share many of the pains that Al has just described and recognise kind of that from our kind of early stages of work. So as a similar size practice to IFDO, we principally do two types of work. So homes and housing. So this is Grain House that we did completed in 2021, and then also education and community projects. And I'll talk a little bit about the importance of cross-sector work and how that makes for a kind of a larger a more reliable sense of profitability in terms of how you plan different work at different sectors. For practices of our scale, people rarely talk about some of the kind of the key statistics and key numbers kind of behind what we do, and I'm very happy to do that, and I'm very proud that we should be able to talk about the kind of the numbers and the finance that goes into what we do. So as Hattie said, we were established over 20 years ago. We do quite a range of projects. We still do quite small projects that might only be £250,000 and up to our largest, which is around about 15 million. And interestingly, I did have to go back and calculate it. We had 33 fee earning projects and actually 33 different clients in the last financial year. And as Hattie said, we're 16 people and split between London and Bristol and a bit in Devon as well. But also in terms of just understanding what that means. So we have a turnover of 1.5 million, or just under 1.5 million last year. But actually, when you take out sub-consultants fees, which we carry on some of the kind of community and public sector projects, the actual architectural turnover was more like 1.2. And similarly, to Al, is that we did actually just about achieve a 20% profit last year. We generally aim for 25. In most of our fee proposals, and then slightly fail. And then it comes out nearer kind of 20 kind of in the end. And obviously there are winners and losers kind of within that as well. So there are two kind of key things that I'm going to talk about. So I'm not going to replicate what Al was talking about, but talking about valuing innovation as part of our architectural service and what that means in terms of fees, but also not losing profit in the gaps between work stages and workflow around projects. So one of the things that we are kind of passionate about is innovation and and selling, and I don't mind using the word also selling our services in terms of what we kind of think we can offer. So I'm nicking some slides from Russell Curtis. I'm sure he won't mind that he gave to some of my students in Brighton, where he talked about the value of our service as architects relative to the value of a building. So if, for example, you say that a cost of a building might be 1, then the cost of, say generically, design might be 0.1, i.e. it's obviously a much smaller portion than the building itself. But over, say, a 60-year lifespan of a building, the cost of maintenance might be significantly more than both the cost of the building and obviously the cost of our fees. And then if you include the cost of the client in use for all of the energy, all of the costs that they're likely to incur. And obviously this is a diagrammatic notional, it's not scientific, but it puts our fee in perspective. And so you kind of have to question, if you spend a little bit more on that cost of design and with a view to actually kind of reducing the cost of maintenance and reducing the cost of the building in use, the impacts can be massive. And so I think, one of the key things that we do is we talk about that kind of innovation. And I'm going to give an example from our greenhouse, which won House of the Year, RIBA House of the Year in 2023. And so some of the stats kind of for that. So it was a 559k project. It was built for just under £3,000 a square metre, which even when its tender price was mid 2020. So even though it is kind of almost 4.5 to 5 years old, that was still good value kind of at that particular point. And one of the things that we talked about with clients is that, we spend our fee using our architectural expertise, and in this case, innovating with cheap materials in order to keep the cost of the project down. And so bigging up the cost of our service and how the cost of our service can minimize or at least optimize the cost of the construction kind of part of the way through that process. So for example, on Greenhouse, one of the key areas where we did spend money was on the CLT, the cross-laminated timber, and we spent it on the tech kit. It was an air source heat pump, it had PVs, it had a battery backup. And so the two big cost expenditures with the cross-laminated timber and the M&E kit. That was where the value lay in the project. Where it didn't lie was in some of the fabrics and some of the elements. So, for example, the cladding on the rear of the building you can see at the bottom there is from an agricultural building. I'm not quite sure what the cost is, but literally it was under £10 a square metre in terms of the cost of that kind of product. We didn't have things like architraves and door stops and fancy kind of door detailing. The door frames literally routed into the CLT. And similarly, on the top right-hand side, you can kind of see the windows, which were deliberately, we raised the upstand at the bottom of that window deliberately to fit the kind of the optimum size from the window manufacturing. And because we knew that the cost uplift would go above about 20 to 30% up the minute we made that kind of 10 centimeters kind of deeper. So it was kind of using kind of innovation, using kind of our design skill to help kind of minimize cost. And so kind of we see this, setting the fee is as much about setting the value of the innovation you offer as much it is about covering the cost of your service. And I was talking to some of my students yesterday, and in one of the pieces that one of them's writing at the moment, they came up with this amazing phrase, which I've had to nick from their submission, and I did say I was going to do it beforehand, and that how we should be encouraging clients to see architecture as a strategic investment rather than an expense, as a way about kind of selling our service and doing what we do. So that's the first one. The second one was about not losing profit in the gap. So you can be really good, as Al has talked about, at making profit at each RIBA stage of each project, but still as a practice not be profitable. Why?
I think you need to speed it up, Nick.
I
know you've got into the good stuff now.
I'm getting the good stuff. So often we find it's the gaps between work stages and the gaps between staff workflow, which are where kind of issues can occur. So using fresh projects, this was an example actually on Greenhouse of stage 4+, which was basically the procurement stage, which didn't have a fee allocated. We spent almost £9,000 of our fee. Sorry, £9,000 of time that we didn't receive a fee for. Kind of doing that kind of post-planning pre kind of construction stage. We did make a profit at the site stage, but still it didn't quite kind of cover it. And so this led to a review of some of the kind of the key things that we now do and talking about the gaps between projects. So stage 3+, so the time between submitting a planning application and starting detailed design, we now do a time charge. Stage 4+, so the time between issuing tender information and starting on site, we now do as time charge. And importantly, stage 5 and prolongation of works on site. I'd like to say every project finishes on time, but I'd be fibbing if I said it did. And so, invariably that has additional cost to it. We need to make sure, and as Al talks about in terms of doing the weekly cost, of how important that is to deal with that. And again, stage 6 in terms of doing time charge. But importantly, these are fees that don't, if you're working to a percentage, these are fees that don't form part of a percentage fee, and that it's important that these are clarified, that these are kind of additional to that. So top tips for proposals is define periods between work stages as work stages themselves. So in our case, we call them 3+ and 4+, and make sure it's explicit what the scope of this is and how it'll be charged. Make sure that there's a prolongation clause in the T&Cs at RIBA stage 5 and set out how it will be charged. And also, as Al talked about, note that the percentage fees are based on a final contract value and not over all RIBA stages. And then during the project, be clear with a client when a work stage is finished and when a new one is starting. And also enforcing T's and C's, making sure that you charge the additional fees that you have occurred. Otherwise, you'll be giving away your professional expertise for free. And then also making sure that LDs kind of include an allowance for prolongation fees, kind of plus VAT if it's domestic, and making sure that as you go along, you put in the mechanisms to be able to kind of charge for those. So just very...
okay, you're out of time, so
okay,
wrap it up.
I'll wrap it up. So the other one between work stages, and so bigger projects. So we do a mix of projects deliberately to enable the smaller projects to fill the gaps between the larger ones. And so we do a combination of kind of programming that helps organize this and also kind of map that into and charge that into utilization rates. So every month we update our our project programming and where all our projects sit. But also every month we kind of reassess our utilization rates, kind of making sure that we allow for direct and non-time, and also the gaps to exist. And so you can see, for example, we might be 15 people, but actually when you work it out, we're about 11 FTEs worth of actual fee earning time across that. And that is that. Thank you.